The moment that reflection leaned toward me, just slightly, just enough to break the last fragile illusion that it belonged to me, I felt something change inside my chest. Not in the way fear usually rises, sharp and immediate, but in a slower, more controlled way, like something had settled into place where it shouldn't have been. Something that didn't belong to my body but had found space there anyway. My breathing stopped feeling natural. That was the first clear sign. Not that I couldn't breathe, but that I wasn't fully in control of it anymore, like the rhythm had shifted just enough to feel unfamiliar, like there was a second pattern overlapping mine, slightly out of sync, slightly delayed but present in a way I couldn't ignore once I noticed it. Inhale, a fraction too deep. Exhale, a fraction too slow. And then another inhale, not matching the first, not matching me. My throat tightened immediately, my awareness snapping inward, focusing on something that had always been automatic until now, something I had never needed to question before. Breathing, simple, unconscious, mine. But now, not entirely. I held my breath. Instantly, a sharp, deliberate stop. And for a second, everything went still. No sound, no movement, no shift from outside or inside, just silence. Then, something else inhaled. Soft, close, too close. Not from the yard, not from the hallway. From right behind me. My entire body locked, every muscle tightening at once, not in panic, but in resistance. In refusal to react in a way that would confirm what I already knew but hadn't fully allowed myself to accept. Because that sound, that breath, hadn't come from my lungs. And yet it had matched my position perfectly, aligned with me in space in a way that made it feel less like something standing behind me and more like something occupying the same place I did. Just slightly offset. You can feel it now. The voice didn't come from outside. It didn't come from behind me. It came from everywhere, soft, even, certain, and closer than anything had been so far. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because speaking now felt like opening something, like giving shape to a connection that was already forming without my consent. Like turning toward a presence that had been careful not to force itself into full view yet. My hands curled slightly at my sides, fingers tightening just enough to remind me they were still mine, that some part of me was still separate, still in control, still capable of resisting whatever this was trying to become. Outside, the creature shifted, finally, not toward the fence, not away from it, but slightly forward, closer to the line between yard and house, as if responding, as if something inside had reached a point that allowed something outside to move again. The connection between them wasn't just implied anymore. It was active, linked, coordinated. You're almost there, that same voice again, calm, measured, not urging, not forcing, just confirming. Like something watching a process reach its final stage. My chest tightened again because the breathing hadn't stopped, even though I was holding my breath as still as I could, refusing to give any movement, any sound, any sign that I was participating in this. Something was still breathing, in my space, with my rhythm, but not under my control. Slowly, carefully, I tried something. I shifted my hand just a little, a small, deliberate movement, and immediately the reflection in the glass followed, not delayed this time, not out of sync, perfect, matching, normal. But that didn't bring relief because it meant something else. It meant whatever had been out of sync had corrected itself, had adopted, had learned. My pulse hit harder in my chest, each beat more noticeable than the last because that pattern, the delay, the independence, the misalignment, it wasn't a flaw. It had been a phase, something incomplete, something in progress, and now it was gone. You don't need to fight it, the voice again, closer now than ever before, not outside, not behind, inside the space where my thoughts should have been. And that was when the realization settled in fully, without resistance, without denial, without any room left to misinterpret what was happening. The thing behind me was no longer just behind me, and the thing outside was no longer waiting to get in. They had both been moving toward the same point from the very beginning, and that point was me. It didn't happen with a sound. That's what made it worse. No creak of hinges, no shift of the frame, no movement I could point to and say, that's when it opened. And yet, something changed. Not outside, not behind me, but in the way the air moved through the doorway, in the way the night no longer felt separated from the inside of the house, like the line that had existed between those two spaces had quietly dissolved without needing permission, without needing force, without needing anything at all. I didn't turn, I didn't step forward, I didn't touch the handle, but I knew the door wasn't closed anymore, not in the way it had been before. My chest tightened slowly, my awareness stretching outward again toward the yard, toward the pen, toward the thing that had been watching from beyond the fence, because whatever had shifted inside me had changed something outside as well, like both sides of this had been waiting for the same moment to arrive. And when I looked, it was closer, not at the fence anymore, not listening, not learning, past it, inside the yard, standing in the open space between the pen and the house as if the boundary that had held it back minutes ago had never existed at all. Its shape was clearer now, not fully revealed, but enough. The proportions were still wrong, too lean, too elongated, the spine rising and dipping in ways that didn't align with anything natural, the limbs positioned with a precision that felt intentional rather than instinctive, as if every part of it had been arranged for function rather than formed for life. And the way it held its head, higher now, more direct, focused entirely on the doorway, on me. The metallic smell hits stronger, sharper, almost overwhelming now, mixing with that damp, raw scent until the air felt thick enough to taste, like something had been brought closer that wasn't meant to exist in this space, something that carried with it the residue of whatever it had already done. Behind me, the breathing continued, steady, controlled, not mine, but perfectly aligned with my position, and for the first time since this began, I realized something that shifted the fear into something colder, something more precise. I didn't know where it was behind me anymore, because it wasn't confined to a position. It wasn't standing in the hallway. It wasn't moving through the rooms. It was overlapping, existing in the same space without fully displacing anything, like a second presence layered over mine, sharing the same point but not the same control. You opened it. The voice came again, not accusing, not questioning, just stating. And I wanted to argue, wanted to say I hadn't touched the handle, hadn't spoken, hadn't given permission in any way that should matter. But the words didn't come, because something inside me already understood what that meant. Opening wasn't physical, it wasn't mechanical, it was internal, gradual, built from every moment of attention, every second of focus, every hesitation that had allowed this to continue instead of ending it. And I had been standing here, engaging since the very beginning. Outside, the creature took another step closer, the distance between us shrinking now in a way that no longer felt slow or measured, but inevitable, like the final stage of something that had already been decided long before this moment. Inside, the reflection in the glass shifted again, but this time, it didn't match me at all. It leaned forward, closer to the glass, closer to the line where inside met outside, and its expression, calm, still, certain, like something that had finally reached where it needed to be. My breath caught against them. I could feel both of them, not separately, not as two threats, but as parts of the same movement, one from outside, one from within, closing in, synchronizing, aligning. And in that terrible, quiet understanding, I realized the most dangerous part of all of this hadn't been the fence or the door or even the thing inside the house. It had been the moment I chose to stay, because now there was no longer a clear way to leave. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where fear stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like a realization. And as I stood there with the night pressing in from the doorway and that second presence pressing in from behind me, I felt that shift happen with a clarity that didn't leave room for denial, because this was no longer about what might happen or what could be avoided. It was about understanding what had already taken place without me fully noticing it. I wasn't alone in my body anymore, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but spatially, in a way that made every small movement feel uncertain, like I couldn't fully account for what belongs to me and what didn't, like the space I occupied had become shared without my permission ever being clearly given. My fingers twitched slightly at my side, a small, involuntary motion, and for a fraction of a second, it didn't feel like mine. The movement completed, but the intention behind it lacked, like the action had occurred before I had decided to make it, like something else had anticipated the motion and executed it just ahead of me. My chest tightened immediately, my awareness snapping inward again, trying to reassert control, to reclaim something as basic as movement. But the more I focused on it, the more unstable it felt, like control itself had become something I had to fight for rather than something I naturally processed. "You're still resisting," the voice came again, soft, measured, but closer than ever before, not around me, not behind me, inside the exact point where my thoughts should have formed. And that was when I understood something that made everything else fall into place in a way that felt far too complete to be a coincidence. This wasn't about getting inside the house. It wasn't even about getting close to me. It was about alignment. The thing outside had been approaching physically. The thing inside had been approaching internally. And now they were both here, meeting at the same point. My reflection in the glass moved again, not with me, not after me, but independently. It raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, toward the surface of the glass. My hand stayed still, at my side, but the reflection's fingers touched the pane, and I felt it. A faint pressure, not on my skin, but just beneath it, like something pressing outward from the inside rather than inward from the outside. My breath hitched sharply because that meant something had crossed the line I hadn't even known was there. Something that had started as observation had become interaction. Outside, the creature stepped closer again, not fully clear in the yard, no longer blending into shadow, no longer partially hidden, its form still wrong, still unnatural, but defined enough now to confirm that whatever it was, it had always been real, and it was no longer waiting. You don't need to separate it anymore. The voice again in that line, that specific phrasing, cut through everything else because it implied something I hadn't allowed myself to think yet, that the separation I had been trying to maintain between inside and outside, between me and it, between control and influence, was no longer necessary because it was already gone. My reflection leaned closer, forehead nearly touching the glass, eyes fixed forward, calm, unblinking, and slowly it began to mirror the shape of the thing outside. Not fully, not completely, but enough. The posture shifting, the alignment changing, the subtle distortion of proportion starting to show through. And that was when the final realization settled in, not as fear, not as panic, but as something colder, something complete. This had never been two separate things working together. It had always been one thing, reaching me from both sides, and now there was nowhere left for it to go except fully through. There's a point where control doesn't break all at once, where it doesn't matter, it doesn't shatter or collapse in some dramatic, obvious way, but instead begins to slip in small, precise moments that feel almost harmless until you realize they weren't yours to begin with. And as I stood there with my reflection pressed close to the glass and that thing in the yard closing the last distance between us, I felt that shift happen inside my own body in a way that was too subtle to fight and too clear to ignore. My hand lifted, not quickly, not violently, but smoothly, deliberately, like a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought, and the movement was simply catching up to it. I didn't tell it to move, I didn't even think about moving, and yet it rose slowly toward the door, my chest tightened hard and my awareness snapping into focus, every part of me trying to pull back, to stop it, to interrupt the motion before it reached anything that mattered. But the movement didn't hesitate, didn't falter. It continued with a calm certainty that didn't belong to me. Outside, the creature stopped moving, not because it had reached the door, but because it no longer needed to. Inside, my reflection smiled again. That same small, controlled curve that had nothing to do with my own expressions, nothing to do with the tension locking my face in place, nothing to do with the fear building steadily in my chest. My hand reached the door, fingers hovering just above the surface, not touching, not yet, but close enough that I could feel the faint coolness radiating from it. The boundary between inside and outside now reduced to something so thin it no longer felt real. You don't have to fight it anymore. The voice didn't sound persuasive now, didn't sound patient. It sounded final, like something that had already accounted for every possible resistance and found it insufficient. My breath came uneven, my lungs struggling to keep pace with a rhythm that no longer felt entirely mine. That second pattern still layered over it, still present, still guiding something beneath the surface of my control. My fingers pressed lightly against the wood, and the moment they did, I felt something shift, not in the door, in me, like a connection completing itself, like a circuit closing. My reflection's hand pressed against the glass at the exact same moment. Perfectly aligned now, no delay, no difference, no separation. And outside, the creature took one final step, right up to the threshold, close enough now that I could see more than just shape. The details, still wrong, still unnatural, but unmistakably present. Its skin, or whatever, stretched across it, tight and uneven. The structure beneath it, too defined in some places and too absent in others. The head angled just slightly in a way that felt like observation rather than instinct. And its eyes, finally visible, not glowing, not exaggerated, but empty in a way that absorbed attention rather than reflecting it, like looking into something that didn't return what you gave it. My hand began to push, slowly, not opening the door, just testing it. And I felt resistance, not from the lock, not from the frame, from myself. That last piece of control, that last fragment of separation, pushing back just enough to remind me that I was still there, still present, still capable of stopping this if I acted now. But the pressure from the other side, from both sides, was stronger. "You're already there," the voice again, quiet, certain. My reflection leaned closer, the creature outside leaned closer, and for a moment, everything aligned perfectly. Movement, breath, presence, all of it centered on the same point, on the same action, on the same final step. My hand pushed again. The door shifted, just slightly, barely enough to notice, but enough. Enough to break something that couldn't be repaired once it was gone. And in that moment, I realized the most terrifying part of all of this wasn't that something was trying to get inside. It was that my body had already decided it belonged there. The smallest movement of the door should have sounded like something: wood resisting, hinges reacting, air being displaced. But what I remember instead is how quiet it was, as if the house itself had decided not to acknowledge what was happening, as if noise would have made it real in a way it refused to accept. My hand was still on it, still pushing, but the strange part wasn't the motion anymore, it was the agreement behind it. Because the resistance I felt wasn't strong enough to stop me, and it wasn't weak enough to be meaningless. It was conditional, like the door wasn't refusing. It was waiting for completion. My breath came shallow again, layered over something that no longer felt entirely mine. That second rhythm still threaded through it, still aligned with the space behind me and the presence outside, like both sides had finally synchronized into a single, unified pressure. And I was the only variable left. "You're almost finished," the voice said, not encouraging, not urgent, just observing the final stage of something inevitable. My reflection in the glass stayed perfectly still now. No delay, no mismatch, just presence. A version of me that no longer needed correction. Outside, the creature stood exactly at the threshold, not moving, not pressing, just existing at the point where crossing was no longer about distance. It was about permission being finalized, and then I felt it. Not a command, not a force, a release. Something inside the door mechanism shifted, not mechanically, but perceptually, like the concept of locked had stopped applying in the way it used to. My fingers tightened slightly, not pulling back, not pushing forward, just holding. Because now even hesitation felt like participation. "You don't need to decide anymore." The voice again, soft, perfectly calm, and that calmness was what made everything worse, because there was no struggle in it now, no negotiation, no persuasion, only completion. My reflection moved first, its hand pressed fully against the glass, flattened, complete contact, and I felt it again, deeper this time, not on the surface of my skin, but inside the structure of my awareness, like something pressing into the shape of me from the inside out. Outside, the creature tilted its head slightly, not curious, not cautious, recognizing. My hand on the door followed through, slowly, inexorably. The last resistance inside me didn't break, it relaxed, and that was worse, because it didn't feel like defeat, it felt like permission being accepted. The door moved another fraction, not opening wide, not revealing everything, just enough. Just a seam, just a line that was no longer intact. And in that narrow space, I saw it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand that the distinction I had been holding on to, inside versus outside, self versus other, threat versus observer, had already collapsed long before my hand ever touched the wood. Because what was outside wasn't entering, and what was inside wasn't leaving. They were meeting exactly where I stood, and I was no longer the barrier between them. I was the point where they connected. The voice spoke one last time, not from outside, not from behind, not from reflection, but from everywhere at once. Now we are aligned, and the door was no longer a door, it was a continuation. There is a strange stillness that follows when something finally stops pretending to be separate from you, a silence that doesn't feel like relief or resolution, but like a system completing itself in the absence of resistance. And I remember standing there with my hand still on the door, feeling that stillness settle into everything at once, into the wood, into the air, into my breath, into the space behind my eyes where thought used to feel like mine alone. The seam in the door remained, not widening, not closing, just existing, like a truth that had been revealed but not yet fully understood. I didn't pull my hand away, and I didn't push further, because neither action felt like it belonged to me anymore. Outside, the creature didn't move, it didn't need to. It was already at the point it had been moving toward from the beginning, not physically, not in distance, but in definition, as if the idea of outside had finally reached its limit and no longer had meaning in relation to where I stood. Inside, my reflection no longer looked like a reflection. It looked like confirmation, a completed version of something that had been forming in parallel, now finally synchronized, no longer delayed, no longer divided, no longer uncertain. And the space between them, between that glass, that door, that breath, that awareness, it felt thinner than thought itself. The voice did not return, it didn't need to, because whatever had been speaking before was no longer describing what was happening. It was simply present within it. My fingers loosened slightly on the wood, not from choice, from completion. That last fragment of resistance, the part that had been holding on to separation, didn't disappear. It just stopped applying, like a rule that had been obeyed for too long finally being retired. And in that absence, everything felt connected, not merged, not destroyed, just continuous. A single, uninterrupted state where inside and outside were no longer opposites, only positions that had stopped meaning anything. The creature beyond the threshold remained still. My reflection remained still, and I was no longer in between them. I was where both of them met. The door no longer mattered, not because it was gone, but because it had fulfilled its purpose. A boundary only exists as long as it is believed, and mine had stopped being believed. The last thing I remember clearly is not movement, or sound, or even fear. It's the realization that nothing was coming anymore, because nothing needed to come. Everything had finally already arrived, and I was still standing exactly where it had all been pointing from the beginning, right at the center of it.